This is the beginning of part 2 of our module on managing foreign exchange exposures. We remind you that this part 2 contains chapters 3 and 4, with chapter 3 examining a number of more sophisticated FX hedging strategies, including seagulls, participator forwards, and leveraged strategies, and chapter 4 containing the final quiz. This chapter 3 examines more sophisticated hedging strategies designed to reduce or eliminate option premiums for the user, and also analyzes the advantages of these strategies. But it also discusses why some of them, particularly those associated with leverage, have become so controversial in recent times. We begin this chapter by returning to the case of the exporter with the 10 million sterling receivable, who had bought a 145 sterling put and had sold a 160 sterling call. The various outcomes for the exporter were summarized in the table reproduced now. You will recall that we achieved a net upfront premium under that strategy of $310,000, now turning red in this table. Consider what would happen now if we altered the strikes under this color a little and also added a third option on top of the two we already have. An infinity of alternatives exists, of course, but we will limit ourselves to two particular ones described next. Under the first alternative, the exporter achieves a net upfront premium of 0, as you can confirm in your own time from worksheet pricing, by combining a long sterling 138 put, short sterling 155 call, and long sterling 169 call. His summarized position and related outcomes can now be amended to read as shown here. These outcomes are plotted now on this worksheet, Seagull 1 appearing in front of you, with the graph for our present structure appearing here in blue, while the faint olive diagonal shows the unhedged position, and of course the orange horizontal, the forward-based solution. The present combination is referred to as a seagull on account of its similarity in appearance to that seafaring bird. Note that under this particular combination of puts and calls, the seagull's wings are flapping upward. The structure has eliminated the exporter's upfront premium entirely and provides the benefit of guaranteed minimum dollar proceeds of $13.8 million to be specific. And while the structure initially appears to cap aggregate proceeds at $15.5 million, the exporter in fact benefits from additional sterling upside if the currency ends above 169. The drawback, of course, is that between 155 and 169, the exporter does not share in any of this appreciation, so that when sterling exceeds 169, the proceeds in dollars to the exporter from his receivables fall substantially below those of an unhedged competitor, but never by more than $1.4 million. In summary, the exporter who opts for this seagull solution finds attractive the fact that if he is wrong about sterling and the currency strengthens instead of weakening, his maximum competitive disadvantage versus unhedged competitors per unit of sterling exposure is capped at the difference between the strikes of the two calls, or $1.4 million in total in this particular example. In contrast to his unhedged competitors, however, he is assured a respectable minimum on his dollar proceeds, no matter how badly sterling may fare in a weakening scenario. The reasonableness of this trade-off, as ever, is the exporter's to evaluate. We turn now to the second alternative. The exporter here again achieves a net upfront premium of 0, this time by combining a long sterling 144 put, which is the principal instrument that will protect him, with two short options, specifically a short sterling 155 call and also a short sterling 135 put, all on notionals of 10 million sterling as before. Again, you can confirm in your own time on worksheet pricing that the net premium has been eliminated. The two short positions are in essence financing the premium for the option that the exporter is really after, namely the 144 put. But they expose the exporter to risks we will analyze in just a moment. The exporter's summarized position and related outcomes can now be amended one more time to read as shown here. These outcomes are plotted on this worksheet Seagull 2, appearing now in front of you, with the graph for the present structure appearing here in light blue, against once again the unhedged position in olive and the forward hedge in the orange color. Again, the current graph reveals a seagull shape, but this time flapping its wings downward, i.e. in the opposite direction from the previous illustration. So, what would attract our exporter to this particular alternative? Again, the upfront premium is 0, and this time the strike of 144 under the long put offers substantially better protection initially than the strike of 138 under the previous alternative. The main risk, however, is that if sterling weakens substantially, and specifically beyond 135, the short put position goes in the money, draining proceeds away from the exporter and ultimately putting him at a disadvantage to those who, for example, used the first Seagull alternative. Seagull 2 also does not permit the exporter to start sharing again in a stronger sterling, no matter how far the currency appreciates. This worksheet comparison shows the two seagull graphs directly on top of one another to enable a comparison of outcomes that may be easier for some listeners. Note in particular Seagull 2's outperformance over here on the left in the light blue of Seagull 1 in the black. Then in the middle, they're perfectly matched positions. In fact, you cannot even see the light blue color in Excel of Seagull 2 up this diagonal. And finally, on the extreme right, over here, Seagull 1's outperformance in black of Seagull 2. This brings to an end our discussion of seagull structures, but a question in the quiz will call your attention to some interesting features of the price sensitivities of seagull combinations. The next strategy we illustrate here is one that arises when the FX forward trades at a premium to the spot rather than at a discount, as it does in the previous example. To simulate the circumstances that lend themselves especially well to the strategy we wish to illustrate, we have returned to worksheet pricing and now invert the relative magnitude of the interest rates so that sterling now yields only 1%, say, while the US dollar now yields 3.75%. Note that this causes the 1 year forward to rise from our previous 147 to 1.54. This change also affects all option prices previously shown in our pricing grid, which is now restated here to reflect the switch in the two interest rates. Note specifically that a sterling put struck at the current spot of 1.5, which just turned red in the column for puts, costs $0.0405 per pound, a point to which we will return shortly. Now let's examine prices for sterling calls, anticipating that with sterling forward at a premium to spot as it is here, a sterling call that is not too far away from the current spot should be extremely valuable. We see that a sterling call struck at the same 150 strike as the sterling put would earn as much as $0.0808 per pound, just turned red in the column for calls, which is almost exactly twice the premium for the sterling put. So one strategy, known as a participator forward, that runs parallel to one that is commonly used in interest rate hedging and discussed in our parallel module on managing interest rate exposures, is to sell this sterling call but on only 5 million sterling of notional, so as to preserve for the exporter the ability to reap significant benefits from any appreciation of sterling, while being protected if sterling falls from its current level of 1.5. You should have little trouble confirming that the premium for the sold call almost completely equals the premium for the bought put, when the different notionals are taken into account. To summarize, this presents the company with a strategy that requires no upfront premium, protects the company at the current sterling spot rate under any future scenario of depreciating sterling, and still leaves the company able to benefit from any strengthening in sterling for as much as 50% of its original exposure. The graph appearing here in blue shows the final outcome under this strategy and contrasts it, as usual, to the original unhedged position in olive and to a hedge involving an outright forward in orange. You should note especially the more modest inclination of the diagonal on the right under this solution, reflecting the 50% exposure to an appreciating sterling under this strategy. Depending on the size of the forward premium relative to spot, and this premium can be very large when one of the rates is in double digits, for example, the 2-to-1 ratio in the option premiums can increase substantially, diminishing the notional of calls the exporter must sell to offset the premium on the bought put, and by extension, retaining exposure to any appreciation of the underlying currency for a percentage larger than the current 50%. A quiz question will present this fact pattern and invite you to describe the solution. We conclude this chapter and the pre-quiz part of the entire module by discussing leveraged strategies. When contemplating zero premium strategies, such as the collars we described earlier, companies sometimes object to the sale of the sterling call at a level that is so close, relatively speaking, to the spot level, as in the second example in particular, involving a collar where the call was struck at 155 while the spot stood at 150. An alternative is to raise the strike of the sold call, which of course reduces the premium earned by the seller, but to offset that by increasing the notional amount of the sold call. Suppose the company continues to want the put struck at 140, which we remind you costs $0.0282 per 1 pound sterling of notional. The company is reluctant to sell a call struck as low as 155 and is more comfortable with a call struck at 165, which earns it the more modest premium of $0.0094 per pound sterling of notional. Noting that the call's premium per pound happens to be exactly 1/3 of the premium for the put, you suggest to the company that it increase the notional of the sold call to 30 million sterling to generate the necessary premium that offsets entirely that of the bought put, arguing that such a high level of sterling in just 1 year's time appears far-fetched. You point out that not only is the 165 strike 15 cents above the current spot of 150, it is almost 18 cents above the forward level of 1.4703, which is arguably the more relevant benchmark for estimating the likelihood that this sterling level might materialize in 1 year. In exchange, the company would be taking the risk that if in fact sterling spot should rise to this remote level of 165 or higher over the next year, the company would find the bank exercising the sold call and requesting delivery of £30 million at a price of 165, only 10 million of which the company would actually have from settlement of its receivable. This would therefore require the company to purchase the missing £20 million from the spot market, where by hypothesis these would cost more than the 165 that the bank will be receiving for them under the call upon delivery. Before revealing the table with the 3 potential outcomes, we examine by means of a diagram one instance in which sterling spot rises above the call strike of 165. For example, where sterling rises to 175. Right before settlement of the receivable, the company would be long the 10 million sterling receivable, long the 10 million sterling put struck at 145, and over on the left, short the 30 million sterling call struck at 165, as shown on this diagram. We can deconstruct, so to speak, this 30 million short sterling call into the sum of 2 smaller short call positions, one for a notional of 10 million sterling and the second one for a notional of 20 million sterling, as shown now on this diagram. Upon settlement of the receivable up at the top of the diagram, the £10 million collected from the UK company can be used immediately over on the left to satisfy the exercise of the smaller short call, bringing in for the US company an amount of $16.5 million given the strike of 165. The long sterling put over on the right, of course, expires worthless, being so far out of the money, leaving only the 20 million short sterling call position for us to deal with. To honor this outstanding obligation, the US company now goes to the spot FX market appearing at the bottom of the diagram and purchases 20 million sterling at the spot rate of 175, therefore for a total price of $35 million. Then delivers these 20 million pounds under the outstanding sterling call and receives in return the amount of $33 million, being the notional of this call times the 165 strike. This short call position has cost the US company a net amount of $2 million, reducing its proceeds from the above from $16.5 million to $14.5 million. And the higher the sterling spot rate reaches, the more expensive the purchase of the missing 20 million sterling, and the lower the proceeds the US company gets to keep from the original $16.5 million that it collects from exercise of the first sterling 10 million call by the bank. As a useful exercise, you should calculate the level, admittedly very remote, at which the net proceeds to the US company from this entire strategy come to zero. Click the pause button while you work on this question. Once again, your exercise is to calculate the very remote sterling spot level at which the net proceeds for the company from this entire strategy becomes zero. The solution to the above problem is found by solving for S, the spot level of sterling on the settlement date, in the following equation. $16.5 million equals 20 million times S minus 165. In this equation, the quantity on the right-hand side represents the loss to the US company from having to purchase 20 million sterling in the spot market at the price of S, and then delivering them under the 20 million sterling call at the lower price of 165. If the amount of this loss is exactly $16.5 million, i.e. the left-hand side of the above equation, then the US company would be left with nothing. The solution comes to S in dollars equals 16.5 million divided by 20 million plus 1.65, which is $2.475, or almost exactly one full US dollar above the forward level, so certainly extremely remote. Of course, if the sterling spot on the settlement date is even higher than this level, the US company would be left with negative dollar proceeds when the dust has settled, i.e. the US company would have exported the goods to the UK, invoiced its client for 10 million sterling, and yet ended up with a net cash outflow in US dollars rather than a cash inflow all in. We are now better able to understand the summary table for the outcomes under this strategy at expiration, which appears in front of you. Note in particular, on the bottom right cell, turning red now, the formula which pulls the dollar proceeds down rapidly as sterling spot increases, eventually towards zero, as we discussed before. These three sets of outcomes are now plotted on the graph appearing here in the green, which should be self-explanatory given our preceding discussion. Note in particular the difference in the angles between this upward sloping part over here, diagonal, towards the middle of the graph, versus the inverted diagonal that you see over here on the right, when the company's proceeds suffer from the exercise of the large, uncovered short call position. In the area close to the middle, this one here, the company is long 1 unit of 10 million pounds, specifically under the receivable, and therefore benefits penny for penny from increases in the spot level of sterling against the dollar. Whereas, over here towards the right, the company is now short on a net basis 2 units of 10 million pounds, and therefore is hurt 2-for-1 by any further strengthening in the spot sterling level. To confirm your full understanding of this example, we invite you to reflect on a strategy involving the purchase by the US company of a 10 million sterling put struck at 145 and the sale of sterling calls struck at 165 in a notional amount rounded to the nearest whole multiple of 10 million sterling, sufficient to eliminate the premium for the bought put. Your assignment includes the preparation of the summary table and of the final diagram illustrating the 3 possible outcomes. Click pause while you conduct this exercise. The sterling put struck at 145 on 10 million sterling costs the US company $477,000, while the sterling call struck at 165 on 10 million sterling notional earns the company $94,000. It is readily seen that the notional of the short call would need to be set to 50 million pounds to generate an aggregate premium up to $470,000 for the US company, thereby bringing the net premium to close enough zero. The table summarizing the 3 potential outcomes appears next and should raise few surprises. Note in particular the need to sell as many as, over on the left, 40 million sterling of additional calls, over and above, keeping your eyes still on the left, the 10 million sterling of calls that are, as practitioners would say, already covered by the long sterling receivable from the UK company. And note also that as a result of this, now looking at the right column, the formula now turning red in the 4th row on the right, representing the situation in which the US company must scramble to purchase the sterling it does not already have to deliver it under the short call position, now has a multiplier of 4 instead of, in the previous example, 2, which of course will lead to a much steeper graph than before for the section towards the right. The graph for this strategy appears now in front of you in this green color and is contrasted not only, as always, to the unhedged exposure, but also with the previous graph from the preceding worksheet to highlight, as well as possible, the 2 key differences between these 2 leveraged strategies. Once again, leverage 1 and leverage 2. The second strategy provides the US company with a higher level of dollar proceeds over here on the left when sterling weakens, 14.5 million, versus only 14 million under the first strategy. But of course, the second strategy exposes the US company over here in the steep diagonal to greater risk of large declines in its proceeds if sterling rises above the 165 strike of the short calls. As a final exercise, you should please confirm that the dollar proceeds for the US company under this strategy would come to zero if spot is trading at 2.0625 on the settlement date. This potential to incur large losses has made these leveraged option strategies quite controversial. After all, a US exporter that is long a sterling receivable should be delighted to find sterling appreciating to levels that are more than 10% above its current spot level, yet finds itself under the leveraged strategy having to explain to its shareholders and creditors why it has lost a bundle, or at a minimum why it has earned from the export to the UK far smaller proceeds in US dollars than it had anticipated. In the more extreme cases, particularly ones involving Brazilian companies in 2008, but also many others, a sudden appreciation of the US dollar against the real, Brazil's currency, resulted in billion-plus losses for several large exporters, directly resulting from the sale of substantial dollar calls shortly before this large unexpected move in the spot. Too often these losses have resulted in lawsuits against the bank offering the hedge on the basis that the company was not sophisticated enough to understand the risks assumed, and that it relied on the bank to advise it on the appropriateness of the hedge, and or that the bank failed to emphasize the downside scenarios and concentrated instead on the advantages of the strategy. Most financial institutions have therefore developed internal guidelines that restrict their staff from offering these types of strategies to their weaker or less sophisticated counterparts, and often impose additional criteria with regard to the minimum level of internal approval that must be obtained before they will go ahead with such a trade, even with the most creditworthy and sophisticated counterparts. Of course, defining precisely what strategies are deemed leveraged is not an exact science, and institutions are often reluctant to define leverage as involving any strategy in which a company sells options on a notional amount exceeding the notional of receivables it has already created. It is our view that any attempt to define these types of trades is bound to suffer from definitional imprecision and give rise to opportunities on the part of overzealous financial engineers to find loopholes around the rules, and therefore that the best protection the institution can achieve comes from inculcating a culture among its sales staff to think objectively about how capable the client is of understanding the risks of the strategy and how financially able the client is to absorb the worst-case consequences if they materialize. And as always, frank, honest disclosure of downside scenarios summarized in tables and graphs goes a long way towards providing the necessary protection in the event of a subsequent lawsuit by an unhappy customer. This completes this chapter 3 and brings us to the quiz.